Well, welcome to another Living Manna Physical Health Tuesdays. Today we're going to talk about stress and exercise and what exercise can do for you. So I don't have to tell you about what type of a world that we live in now, where there is stress, there is fear, there is anxiety about what it is that's going on. We've got the pandemic that we are still sort of circling around in. We have new viruses on the horizon. There is a question about politics, the stock market, learning, all of these sorts of things. What is it that is going on in all of these things, and how is it affecting our bodies? So if we look back during the pandemic, okay, so this is 2020. By late June of 2020, 40% of adults in the United States reported struggling with mental health or substance abuse. 31% had anxiety, depression symptoms. 13% had started or increased substance abuse. 26% had trauma or stressor-related disorders. And 11% had seriously considered suicide. That's according to the CDC. And what is it that causes this? And what is the effect on the human body? We can only imagine what it is. Well, science is actually giving us some insights into this, and it's actually quite interesting. We're finding out that in the immune system, the innate immune system, that's the part of the immune system that goes around your body looking for things to eat up, things that don't resemble the human body, things that are pathogens or even cellular damage. Okay, so your cells that are not acting appropriately and maybe damaged, these are things that could lead to cancer. So they're damaged and they need to be eaten up by the innate immune system. And the thing that is responsible for that, as we mentioned, is the innate immune system. And those are macrophages. And inflammation is what happens when your immune system gets turned on and starts doing that sort of stuff. And you start to feel heat. You start to feel pain, redness, swelling. These are all signs of inflammation. And there are things that are given off, like tumor necrosis factor alpha. That is a cytokine or a protein that is a signal of inflammation in your body. Cytokines and acute phase protein. So this is all what we know happens when there's an infection or when there is tissue that needs to be broken down. It's part of the innate immune system, and inflammation is what we see. So what happens? Why is this important? Well, Dr. Jennifer Heiss, who is the director of the Fit Lab at McMaster University in Ontario, Canada, said this recently at the beginning of the pandemic about anxiety and worry specifically about the pandemic. She says, quote, "Excessive anxiety about COVID-19 can trigger an immune response that increases inflammation and readies the immune system's equivalent of special forces known as inflammasomes." That's right, inflammasomes. If SARS-CoV-2 acts like other viruses, then upon infection, the inflammasomes will be called to action to escalate the inflammation even further. So if you're worried about getting an infection and then you get the infection, it's even doubly as worse. But too much inflammation, she says, does more harm than good. It deregulates immune function, increasing our risk of a viral infection. And this has been seen in a number of studies. This is one that was published in 2017. It was kind of a review looking at this NLRP3 inflammasome. This is exactly what we were just talking about, is this structure that actually is the hub, if you will, of inflammation and how it's actually tied into mood, in this case, in clinical depression. Here's another story here, the inflammasome, pathways linking psychological stress, depression, and systemic illness. And inside that article, it said, according to this hypothesis, the inflammasome is a central mediator by which psychological and physical stressors can contribute to the development of depression, as well as a bridge to systemic disease. So they have seen and have studied in a number of places, as we have there listed, where the inflammasome has been linked to several autoimmune conditions. Autoimmune conditions are conditions where the body the body's own innate immune system and adaptive immune system are attacking your own system. So diabetes type 1, type 2, inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's disease, like ulcerative colitis, gouty arthritis, multiple sclerosis, and even vitiligo, which is a discoloration of the skin. All of these things can be related to inflammasome pathology. But there was an article that came out that I thought was really interesting in May of 2019, just before the pandemic, in the Journal of Sport and Health Science. And it was titled "The Compelling Link Between Physical Activity and the Body's Defense Mechanism." So this is really interesting what they review. This is a review article. And let's go through the studies that this article pulled out. I think it was really interesting. There was a number of studies, and let's just sort of go through them. There was one that was published by Niemann et al., where they took 36 mildly obese sedentary women, and they randomized them to 15 weeks of moderate intensity exercise. That's about 45 minutes a day for about 5 days a week, walking program or similar, versus an observational control. So observational control, they're not doing the exercise. What did they find in those that did the randomized trial of moderate intensity? So that was about 45 minutes a day. They had fewer days with illness symptoms than versus the controls. And notice it was 5 days of illness for that given period of time versus 10.8 days of illness. So basically less than half of the illness days if they were randomized. So this is a randomized controlled trial, meaning that a lot of confounders gets eliminated because you're randomizing people to a group or it's placebo. Niemann et al. Got excited about this, and he looked at now 91 obese women, aged 45 years of age, plus or minus 1.1 years, and randomized them to a 12-week moderate intensity program. Again, 45 minutes a day, 5 days a week, walking program. What did they find? Again, fewer days with illness symptoms reported in the walkers versus the controls. A couple of other studies, Chubak et al., randomized to 1 year this time. Again, moderate intensity exercise, about 45 minutes a day, versus stretching control. And they found that illness incidence 30% in exercise versus 48% in control. So there was an absolute risk reduction of 18%, which means that you could just treat 5 people with this and you would be able to completely eliminate it here in one person in the year. So a 3-fold decreased risk of illness in the exercise group versus the control in the final 3 months. So in other words, it got better and better and better as time went on. Finally here, Barrett et al., where they took 373 male and female older adults. This is the biggest one here on the page. Randomized them to just 8 weeks of moderate intensity sustained exercise, and they noticed that there was a 14% reduction in illness, a 23% reduction in days of illness, a 31% reduction in global severity, all of these compared to controls. Now, I want you to notice something that's really important. The word moderate, the word moderate, the word moderate, and the word moderate. Notice in all of these situations, they're not asked to go all out, to just really go until they couldn't go at all. This is very low-level, moderate exercise activity. See, the problem is a lot of times when we talk about exercise, we in our mind pull up the advertisements that we see on Instagram or on YouTube or on the television, or we hear about it's time to exercise. We think we've got to be like these people that go to the gym that don't really need to exercise because they look really good. And I want to address that because there's something known as the J-curve, which we're going to talk about a lot in this lecture. And this J-curve describes exactly what happens when you get off the couch and start to actually do some exercise. What we see here are people who are sedentary, and that's here where we're starting off at normal, and they are at 0 in terms of upper respiratory tract infections, although it could be just about anything. And then as you start to go and exercise here to the right, notice that there is a reduction in inflammation. There is a reduction in upper respiratory tract infections. But as you increase to heavy exertion, notice what happens. The J hook starts to go back up, and there could be a 2 to 6-fold increase in infection, in inflammation. And that's the key. That's the key that you need to understand here, is that when we talk about exercise, we're not asking you to win a gold medal at the Olympics. We're not asking you to be the all-world champion. We're asking you to do enough exercise to reduce the inflammation, hopefully down to this area right here, which is the lowest inflammatory point and the lowest level of, in this case, upper respiratory tract infections, so you can get the majority benefit. And why do we say this? Well, because we've looked at studies. We know that moderate, short, acute exercises mobilizes natural killer cells. It mobilizes CD8 highly toxic cytotoxic lymphocytes. It causes stress hormones to remain moderate and not high. And all of this over time enhances immunosurveillance. That means your immune system looking for problems, and lowers inflammation. It's particularly of benefit on people who already have high levels of inflammation, as we'll talk about, obese and diseased individuals. It can be an immune system enhancer. So if you are concerned about people in your area giving you a specific infection, and you know you're going to go into a specific situation where you might be at higher risk, doing a little bit of exercise leading up to that might actually be beneficial. It can give you an enhanced antibody response. Let's say you're about to get a vaccination and you wanted to make sure that your immune system is going to make the most of a sneak peek at that antigen. Well, getting some exercise in would be a good thing to do. How about evidence of summation effect over time, modulating tumorigenesis, atherosclerosis, and other disease processes? Again, moderate is the key word here, short, acute exercise. What happens when we do heavy exercise? We get immune dysfunction, inflammation, oxidative stress, muscle damage. Natural killer cells here it mobilized them. Here we actually get an increase in natural killer cells, neutrophils, and T and B cell function, and many other measurements actually become altered. Altered for hours to days after prolonged intensive exercise. So the key here is that you want to be doing moderate exercise and not heavy exercise if you want to get the most out of your immune system. Again, further evidence of this. Here we look at a walking bout, which is a moderate amount of exercise, versus a marathon race, which is about 26 miles. So what happens here? We know in the DTH, or the delayed type hypersensitivity response, there is a significant reduction when you do a marathon race. Significant reduction, but a specific walking bout actually gives you a slight increase. Same thing happens with salivary IgA, which is something that you want to have if you want to prevent yourself from getting pharyngeal spread of a virus. T cell function is something that you want to have. You lose it with a marathon race. Natural killer cell activity drops significantly with marathon races. Macrophage function, granulocytes, oxidative burst, that's something that you really want to have. All of those things drop with marathon races. All of them increase slightly with moderate intensity exercise. So make sure that you're doing that. Now, the opposite is true here with the neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio, cytokines, and stress hormones. Notice that there's a huge increase in, there's an increase in both, but that increase is much larger in the marathon racer because there is more stress. So that is not a good thing. So if you think about it, if you're not on a professional baseball team, hockey team, going to the Olympics, you really have no basis in terms of your immunity doing that type of really strenuous exercise. A lot of people do marathon races, and I think they ought to be aware of the risk that they're posing to their body and their immune system when they do those sorts of things. How many times have you heard of somebody in COVID-19 dying, and you found out that, wow, and they were a fill in the blank, professional athlete, marathon runner. Well, they are actually degrading their bodies when they are actually causing and pushing their bodies to that stress, such to the point that these teams that we see, people at the Olympics, here we have the hockey team, we have track and field, they are all way out here on this side. And so as a result of that, they are particularly susceptible to upper respiratory tract infections on this graph, but also increased inflammation. Now, what I thought was really interesting was I went out to the sports literature to see what the experts say about this. Because let's face it, folks, when you are on the Olympic team, they want you to go and get a gold medal for their country. That's what they're funding you. That's why they're giving you a coach to train. And you can be absolutely assured that they're going to get the best coaches that money can buy, and they're going to give you the best advice that's going to make sure that you bring home a gold medal. So what I did actually was I went out and I accumulated all of the best evidence from papers that have been published. And this is a summary of the most important guidelines for elite athletes. Okay? So let's say there's two types of people listening to this. There's those who are couch potatoes and who don't get up and exercise, and I want them to get up and exercise just a little bit. But there's those of you out there who go to the gym every day. You have your workout routine. And right now you're kind of freaking out a little bit, right? You're saying, wow, am I doing too much? Well, here is the most important guidelines for elite athletes to keep their immune systems robust and illness rates low despite physiological stress experience. And this is based on some of the best and most recent research here. And I put these here for anybody who wants to learn more about it. But I culled these and basically went through them and found the best advice. And here it is that's listed. So training and competition load management. What should you do? Number 1, develop a detailed, individualized training and competition plan that also provides for sufficient recovery using, guess what? Sleep, nutrition, hydration, and psychological strategies. Number 2, use small increments when changing the training load, typically less than 10% weekly. So you don't want to do too much too quickly. Number 3, develop a competition event calendar that is based on the health of the athlete. So you don't want to overstress yourself. This is the key, is when you are pushing yourself that much and going to the top of that J-hook, you don't want to go too far. Monitor for early signs and symptoms of overreaching, overtraining, and illness. Avoid intensive training when ill or experiencing the early signs and symptoms of illness. Participate in ongoing illness surveillance systems by sports agencies. All right, what about hygienic lifestyle, nutritional, and behavioral strategies? Minimize pathogen exposure by avoiding close contact with affected individuals in crowded, enclosed spaces, and not sharing drinking or eating implements. Avoid exercise sessions in poorly ventilated clubs and gymnasium facilities. The medical staff should isolate infected athletes. Check. All right, limit hand-to-face contact. So you really want to limit your chances of getting infected from somebody nearby. So wash hands, limit hand-to-face contact, and the medical staff should educate athletes to minimize pathogen spread to others. So that's talking about sneezing, coughing, dare I even say masks here in some situations when you can't avoid it. Follow other hygienic practices to limit all types of infections, including, they say here in the recommendation, safe sex and the use of condoms, wearing open footwear when using public facilities to limit skin infections, inspecting or using insect repellents. That's important because malaria can spread through mosquitoes, and covering the arms and legs in clothing at dawn or dusk. So they're showing here that there are certain behaviors that are risky. And here they recommend safe sex. Of course, abstinence is also very good and also prevents you from getting illnesses and diseases that way as well. Probably more appropriate even than safe sex. So hygienic lifestyle, nutritional, and behavioral strategies. Maintain vaccines needed for home and foreign travel with a focus on annual influenza vaccination. Follow strategies that facilitate regular high-quality sleep. Avoid excessive alcohol intake. I would say that studies have shown that any alcohol intake is excessive. And then finally, consume a well-balanced diet with sufficient energy to maintain a healthy weight, with a focus on grains, fruits, and vegetables to provide sufficient carbohydrates and polyphenols that reduce exercise-induced inflammation and improved viral protection. Notice here, this is not talking about a low carbohydrate diet. We'll talk about this later, but actually carbohydrates can be very helpful, especially if they also contain polyphenols. We'll talk more about that. And then finally, follow stress management techniques that decrease extraneous load of life hassles and stresses. Develop coping strategies that minimize the internalized impact of negative life events and emotions. And periodically monitor psychological stresses using available instruments. And it's again because they're way up here on the J-curve hook, all right? Obesity. So what does obesity do? Notice that obesity is basically a way of increasing inflammation. And so if you have inflammation, this is something that you're going to want to avoid, is avoiding obesity because there are reactive oxygen species. Okay, how do you do that? Well, exercise and eating healthy. What about post-exercise, after you exercise? There's some data, and this is what they go into here, that after intense exercise training, that eating fruits such as bananas with water is actually associated with a higher plasma glucose and insulin levels and lower plasma stress hormones. And that's important because what happens is it reduces inflammation. So that's something that you may want to consider if you are exercising quite a bit, is acute carbohydrate ingestion right after you exercise. And then we talked about polyphenols. Look at all this color here. This is just amazing stuff. A high proportion of ingested polyphenols from fruits, vegetables, and other plant foods pass through the small intestine, unabsorbed, and reach the colon, where bacterial degradation promotes smaller phenolics that can be absorbed into circulation after going phase 2 conjugation in the liver. So in other words, things that you can absorb on your own are digested by bacteria. They get broken down into smaller things. They get absorbed, go to the blood, go to the liver, and things get put on them. And these are very important to athletes, including anti-inflammatory, antiviral, antioxidative, and immune cell signaling effects. So this is really important, these polyphenols, things that are very colorful. Okay, good. So we've talked about stress, fear, anxiety, and how you can reduce those, because these things can induce inflammation. And we've just talked about how exercise, if it's done appropriately, can actually reduce inflammation. But let's talk more about depression, stress, and fear. And for that, I want to talk really quickly about this study that was done by our friend Dr. Jennifer Heiss out of the Fit Lab in McMaster University in Ontario, Canada. So she works on a college campus, and students towards the end of the term get very anxious because of their exams, and some can even get depressed, as we'll see. So she looked at 61 university students for 6 weeks. In fact, it was the last 6 weeks of the term. 72% of them were female. She divided them into 3 groups. Number 1, those that did not exercise. Number 2, those that exercised 3 times a week but did it moderately. And those that exercised 3 times a week and did it highly intense. Okay? So in both exercising groups, they did it for 6 weeks, 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. In the moderate intensity exercise, they only went about 84 watts, about 20 minutes a day. Those in the high intensity did 155 watts of workout, only about 20 minutes a day. Those in the moderate got their heart rates up into the 140s. Those in the high intensity up to 174. Those of you who are familiar with the Borg scale, 11 out of 20 for the moderate, 15 out of 20 for the high intensity. This is basically telling them how short of breath they were. Okay, so what did she do? She measured a bunch of things. She measured how depressed they were. She measured enzymes. She measured inflammation. Let's take a look. So the first thing that I want you to notice is the Beck Depression Inventory Scale. This is basically a validated way of measuring how depressed people are. And notice that from the beginning of the 6 weeks to the end of the 6 weeks, those that did no exercise had a significant increase in their depression. And no surprise. I mean, they're under a lot of stress. They have tests. This is going to determine their career potentially. Notice, though, that those that did moderate and intense exercise not only did not get more depressed, they actually got less depressed. But the moderate intensity got less depressed, okay? They actually became much more less depressed. What about anxiety? Not a huge difference there. Again, the moderate intensity came out on top, and perceived stress. Notice that those that exercised more vigorously actually had a higher perceived stress than those that exercised moderately. Again, going along with what we talked about, this J-hook. Now, if we looked at tumor necrosis factor alpha, which we talked about at the beginning, that is an inflammatory cytokine. The huge difference there between those that did not do moderate intensity exercise and those that did. Also, we saw the same thing for IL-6, which is also a cytokine as well. So all of this caused Dr. Heiss to conclude that a critical question we sought to address was whether different physical exercise programs that prevent the development of these depressive symptoms also reduce pro-inflammatory cytokines. Indeed, we found support for this 6 weeks of moderate intensity continuous exercise, which resulted in less depression. And I think that's the key here. If we look at a number of studies, this one was done in 2016 with almost 1,000 participants. When they looked at depression versus no intervention, exercise had a large impact on that. Let's face it, exercise can improve mood almost immediately. It can help you lose weight, which can reduce inflammation, and exercise has very few side effects. Here's another study, a systematic review that was done back in 2019. We looked at 24 studies in this subject, almost 80,000 subjects in this study, versus people with exercise. There was a 13% reduction in those with moderate exercise with elevated anxiety symptoms, a 34% reduction in any general anxiety disorder, and 46% reduction in generalized anxiety disorder specifically. Here's another study that was done this time in July of 2021, looked at 35 women with PTSD, and they looked at this study whether or not exercise in relation to a shock or a post-traumatic event would prevent them from getting post-traumatic stress disorder. And the answer was yes. Exercise in a situation that could lead to post-traumatic stress disorder was more likely to prevent post-traumatic stress disorder than if you did not do it. Again, this J-hook, we're not asking you to go run a marathon. We're asking you to get off the couch, start to do a little bit of walking, start to walk around your house, go outside, do something small, and there'll be some benefits. Let's talk really quickly about what specifically we ought to do, depending on who you are. Preschool age children, 3 to 5 years of age, just be active throughout the day, do a bunch of diverse things. It's great. What about 6 to 17-year-olds? They should be getting 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous exercise every day. That's why they have recess. That's why they have physical education. 3 times a week should have aerobic, muscle strengthening, bone strengthening stuff. Okay, what about adults? After high school, okay, move and sit less during the day. It's really easy to do that because we have jobs that we've got to do. Any kind of activity is beneficial. You should be getting 150 to 300 minutes a week. Okay, that's about 20 to 40 minutes a day of moderate intensity for best, okay? Muscle strengthening, you can do that about 2 days a week. So going to the gym, lifting weights, doing it in your own house, that's great. What about older adults, people who are retired? It's the same as for adults, except you should probably add some balance training to that. We don't want to have falls, so practice your balancing, and you might need to make some adjustments based on some disabilities. What about women during pregnancy? Again, 20 minutes a day. You don't need to decrease a prior routine that you have been doing, although you may want to consult with your obstetrician to make sure you don't have any specific things. Obviously, if you have bed rest, you got to stay on your bed, okay? And what about adults with chronic health conditions or disabilities? Again, 20 to 40 minutes a day, muscle strengthening 2 times a week. Consult with a physician if there are any limitations. So we've seen a lot of evidence that shows that exercise really can have a lot of wonderful effects. I mean, it can improve your mood. It's shown that you can improve your metabolism. It can reduce inflammation. If you're depressed, it can reduce depression. It can reduce perceived stress. And it can reduce the cytokines that you see floating around in your system. So again, We don't want to have too much exercise because that can actually increase things toward the end. Remember that J hook that we were talking about. So for those of you who are, you kind of know where you are, right? You kind of know, are you towards the beginning of that J hook or are you towards the end of that J hook? If you're towards the end of that J hook and you're really committed to exercising a lot, make sure you're taking precautions so that you don't overexert yourself. But I think the majority of us are in that early stage. They're in the early portion of that J hook. And what we really need to start doing is getting outside, getting some fresh air, getting some sunlight, and getting some exercise. You know, we've talked about these things individually. We've talked about sunshine, we've talked about light. But you know, there's something about getting outside and walking around and getting that exercise, maybe even doing something like we showed in the slide, maybe some gardening. You're actually getting the benefit of all of these things all at the same time. So getting outside gives you fresh air. Maybe you're breathing in some of the perfumes of the flowers or the trees. You're getting some near infrared radiation like we've talked about before. You're getting sunlight to your eyes. But you're also getting exercise, and exercise is a great way of reducing inflammation and also helping with your mood. And imagine that exercise and mood together with sunlight is going to have a tremendous impact with your overall mental health and physical health. And that's exactly what we aim to do here. So thanks for joining us. Ask us some questions. Go ahead and email those to us. And I can't wait to see you again on our Physical Health Tuesdays here at the Living Manna Church.